In his celebrated Yoga Sutras, Patanjali in the very first chapter mentions Abhyasa and Vairagya. Abhyasa is described as a long, uninterrupted inquiry into a chosen subject. And Vairagya is renunciation from desires. In the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali goes on to identify that Abhyasa is a developmental process. We can practice at something and improve. And in the very first, what is called Table 1 in Iyengar's commentary on the sutras, he refers to the grades of sadhaka, which is levels of student, or the progressive levels of learning. In any process, not just yoga, but in any process of learning, we move from a slow and undecided steps to learn to become methodical and disciplined. Then we become, if we continue, we'll become more scientific, meaningful, purposeful. And eventually, if we continue in a process, onward, searching through a practice, we will develop a religiosity in our application. But you could say this applies to anything, any process. Somebody can become a swimmer, and they will start and they will tend to be erratic, little haphazard. But if they continue in a process and become and follow that practice, they will both improve, but the quality of their act will change. But this is all held within Abhyasa, long, uninterrupted inquiry. Significant for a yoga practitioner should be a recognition of Vairagya. Just as we can learn and progress in the developmental aspect, there is also a passage down Vairagya. And Patanjali identifies it as, the first of these is called Yatmana, disengaging the senses from action. The second, keeping away from desire. And then the third, stilling the mind. And the fourth, freeing oneself from cravings. So just as we can learn and progress in a developmental pathway, we can also progress down Vairagya, called the renunciate pathway. And at this point I'd make a distinction. In our society, renunciation often has a connotation of to abstain. I will not participate, or I won't have. So it's an act of non-doing, or a cessation of doing. But just as asana, or any practice, we can also develop in the practice of renunciation or vairagya. So it's significant to note that vairagya is a practice. It's not a non-doing, but is an active process of development, and can be conducted in any activity, just like Abhyasa. But it involves a level of self-observation and recognition that transforms it completely. When I act, in my first steps in learning anything, I apply my senses upon it intensively. And at the extreme edge, if I use an example of somebody who's learning something in very fine detail, we say a watchmaker, repairing something. We apply our senses upon the activity. And oftentimes, the intensity of our action causes our senses to be closely, not just closely involved, but closely defined. So I can watch somebody, myself included, when I apply at some very fine detail, and my senses, I hold my breath a little, the lips may become thin, so the sensory involvement is almost breathless. And that would apply across the 5 senses of taste, touch, sight, sound, and smell. The senses are involved. The first, down Vairagya, is to learn to disengage the senses from action. And at this point I would say to be conscious of sensory involvement. Now, within an asana practice, I think we often apply ourselves on the body and we fail. We apply ourselves on the substantial aspect of the body and fail to recognize the subtle involvement of the senses. So we could say a beginner will learn to overcome the obstacles that exist within them. Inertia, doubt, whatever, when you first start anything, that undecided or indefinite aspect. But as we progress, we should start to observe ourselves. So Vairagya, in a way, is much more aligned with self-study and self-observation. And if you continue in this process, keeping away from desire, just as I apply myself on something and study carefully, I can lose my attention or be distracted. So just as much as effort or absorption, always the counterpoint to those is present, so that the mind is inclined, after a time, whether short or long, is inclined to wander. So learning to keep away from desire within an act. So at no time are we talking about some other activity. All held, Abhyasa and Vairagya, all held within a practice. Learning to still the mind. So still, the watchmaker, highly absorbed in the act, the fine detail of the act, can become absorbed in the act. So mind, or the thinking process, changes within the worker. And then lastly, freeing oneself from cravings. So this passageway, this pathway, the renunciate pathway, is one of the most significant aspects. And Guruji often talks about it as the two wings. Just as a bird cannot fly with one wing, so the sadhaka cannot attain yoga without Abhyasa and the second wing of Vairagya. I refer to it as practice-based learning. I have thoughts day to day, month to month, which may or may not be proved correct. The thoughts are often superfluous. They're perspectives, they're moments in time. There may be moments of insight and clarity, but these are not the jewels. The jewel is in the practice and in the witnessing and working with oneself down a process. So the value that yoga has is not in what it gives you, a sense of calmness or tranquility, but the value yoga has is in that process, that developmental process where you can not only train yourself, you can develop at something. And the benefits of a practice in yoga are significant. The health benefits, concentration benefits. So what it does to you is extraordinary. And yet, if all we do is focus on that aspect, we miss the value, the real value, the transformative aspect that yoga promises is down Vairagya. Because down Vairagya, we change how we exist within ourselves. I often think we reconstitute mind. It's the same attribute, the same constituents, but mind changes as the practitioner continues in the process.
How is it possible to evaluate your own progress with Vairagya?
In my experience of Vairagya, Vairagya is a witnessing of it's. We can evaluate the body. We can see if something is straight, if it is aligned. We can objectify it. When we start to practice down Vairagya, now we're starting to evaluate ourselves. And we can use a method down Vairagya, which is to observe what rises. Not necessarily to control what rises. What rises, rises. So we have a practice. Sometimes in my practice, I see passion, sometimes disinterest, sometimes torpor. But when I seek to control those aspects, I am still applying myself down the developmental pathway. So for me, the practice of Vairagya involves observing, and it's often described as when you start to cook the pot, the sediments come up, steam comes off. that in a way what you're doing is cooking through. Watching what rises is significant, because in this way, yoga is not aiming. It's often described as it's not an asceticism. It is not to take oneself away, to remove oneself from the turmoil and from the day-to-day stresses. So we're not, in a way, I often think we're not looking to free ourselves from those, but to live with them. And so as I said earlier, within an act, what cravings, what desires, what involvement of the senses, where does mind go within an act? So at no time are we looking to absent ourselves or to remove them, because these qualities are the qualities of human beings. And when we seek to remove ourselves from being human beings, I think now we have problems. Sometimes I think really this as a practice, Abhyasa and Vairagya, make me more human. Now, my involvement and my attachment to what rises is for me to watch. But the process aspect requires that I go on entering, that I go on, just as I go on working to develop an asana, I go on entering and exposing myself to who I am. So ultimately, the practice of Abhyasa and Vairagya is a humanizing aspect. It makes us more who we are. So on one level, yoga is often conveyed as a transcendent practice, but it can also be viewed as a coming home, a returning, a centering. To free oneself is to exist within. So it is to resolve the tensions that exist within us. And that's the aim of Abhyasa and Vairagya.